I think a new world order is emerging.
An inside job? How dare you? How dare you?
To create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of a scientific caste system.
We shall go on to the end. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall never surrender.
Good day, everybody. This is UCY.tv with the Solvinur Event. I'm your host, Solvinur, known in the Netherlands as Walter, or as they say, Wouter. It's the 1st of August 2015, and today I have a guest. Let's see if we can actually drag him into the conversation. Let's see. Add to conference. Invite to group call. There we go. Let's see if this works, guys.
Hello.
Hello, Robert.
Hello.
Hi, Robert. Can you hear me?
Hello.
Oh my God.
Hello.
Hi. Guys. Okay. What's up with the sound?
I have no idea. Hello.
Hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, okay. I didn't know what was going on here.
All right. Something went wrong, but we're okay now?
Okay. I can hear you if you can hear me.
Yes, we're good to go then.
Excellent.
All right. How are you doing?
I'm fine.
Good, good, good. All right, this is UCY.tv, and there's a couple of people in the chat I usually like to welcome at the start of the show. It's Anok, Anon, Captain, Dan, Hopper, Jules, Lavon, Meticlus, Mr. Van Bolswing, Popula, that's Liza, Road Dog, and those are the chatters for today. If you have any questions, please type them in capital letters so I can pass that on here. Thanks so much for joining me, Robert.
Oh, you're very welcome.
I got a message from John Anthony West that I should get in contact with you. So I thought, well, that sounds like a good idea.
Okay.
Somebody says Robert Schoch is on many Discovery Channel shows. Is that correct?
Well, I suppose that is correct. Discovery Channel, History Channel, I don't know, Sci-Fi, NBC. I've been on lots of different shows.
Awesome.
I actually can't keep track of it because what happens is I think I get interviewed for things and I get interviewed numerous times, and then they also trade clips.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So you end up, people tell me they saw me on something and I never heard about it.
Yeah. Do you have a website?
I do. www.robert, R-O-B-E-R-T, of course, Schoch, S-C-H-O-C-H, that's all together, .com, C-O-M.
Yes.
So www.robertschoch, S-C-H-O-C-H.com, C-O-M.
Yeah, there's a Sphinx there.
Oh, yeah, you got it there.
Things. Yeah. So, as I said in the email, this is not scripted radio. That means I don't have a list of questions ready.
Okay.
My experience is that those are the best kind of shows.
Okay.
Those the non-scripted ones. So I hope you're okay with that.
Yeah, I'm fine.
Cool.
Okay. And have we started yet, or we're starting now?
We are already live.
Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to take questions too. It sounds like you have people that may have questions, so I'm happy to address those also.
Yeah. Somebody claims that you're on Ancient Aliens. I don't believe that.
I've been on Ancient Aliens a number of times.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm misunderstanding this. That you actually do believe that there are ancient aliens? I don't think so, right?
I don't subscribe to ancient alien theories whatsoever, but I've been interviewed a number of times on the History Channel or History Channel 2 in America, Ancient Aliens program. What they do is they have a number of experts on different topics to talk about particular issues, many of whom, in fact, I would say probably the majority of whom do not subscribe to ancient alien theories. But what I find interesting about the Ancient Alien series is that it opens up a new world for many people. They don't understand that there are so many things we don't know about ancient history. There are so many mysteries. So I think in that sense that the Ancient Alien series is interesting. It is enlightening for people. And I would say that based on my discussion anecdotally with people I know and people I meet and people I correspond with, the vast majority of people who probably watch, quote, Ancient Aliens, unquote, the television series, don't actually believe that it's ancient aliens involved necessarily or at all, but there's a real passion among the public to understand what's going on with ancient history and not simply accept the dogmatic view of classical academia, which really sweeps under the rug so many anomalies. So I don't like the name Ancient Aliens personally, but it's been a very successful show, I believe, for that very reason, that it's willing to look at some of these anomalies. Some people might say a bit superficially in some cases. They always have the spin-off, oh, could it be by ancient aliens? Could it be blah, blah, blah? But they always phrase it in terms of questions, not asserting dogmatically. So I think it serves a useful purpose.
Yeah. So I understand you are an archaeologist.
No, you understand incorrectly then.
Oh.
I'm not an archaeologist. I'm a geologist.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
In distinction, I know a lot about archaeology. I will admit I've taken courses in archaeology. I'm currently teaching online through Boston University. I teach full-time at Boston University, in regular classroom, September through May. This summer, as a favor to someone else, basically, I took over a biblical archaeology course. That's a online course. We call it distance education course. So I even am currently teaching an archaeology course. But my actual background, my PhD, is in geology and geophysics from Yale University, and I consider myself a geologist first and foremost in terms of academic credentials.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what is a geologist?
A geologist is someone who studies rocks when it comes right down to it. So I study rocks. I study layers of rocks. I have now, for the last 25 years, applied my expertise in geology to looking at ancient structures, most of which are carved out of rock. So I started with the Great Sphinx. I'm sure, I imagine that John Anthony Westwood, when he was on your program, talked about the Sphinx and the erosion and weathering on the Sphinx.
He did.
My first foray into ancient studies in a professional sense, although I've been interested in ancient civilization since as long as I can remember, under the age of 10, well under the age of 10, so maybe 6 or 7 years old, I was interested seriously in such things.
Yeah.
And I actually was going to study archaeology at one point, but I fell in love with geology. Okay. So I applied geological techniques to ancient structures, ancient sites. I talk about this in various books I've written. So tie in with rocks. One of my earlier books, 1999, is called Voices of the Rocks.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and my most recent book is called Forgotten Civilization, the role of solar outbursts in our past and future, because one thing I'm very interested in as a geologist, and again, this is a distinction maybe between geology and archaeology, is I'm interested in big picture phenomena. I'm interested in natural events, how they tie in with ancient civilizations. I'm very interested in what was happening at the end of the last ice age, 9,700 BC, and how this decimated early civilizations of the time, which I talk about in my book, Forgotten Civilization, for instance. I also mention this a little bit on my website, that type of thing. And if people go to my website after this interview, they can see a short bio of me.
Yeah.
And my various publications, small links to just little, I don't even want to call it articles, little introductions to various topics that I'm interested in as a geologist looking at ancient civilizations.
Yeah, you mentioned civilization and ice age in one word. Am I to understand that there were civilizations like 9,700 years ago?
Yes, this is absolutely the case, and this is something very different than the dogmatic mainstream point of view, the mainstream academic point of view. And I have to point out that I am an academic in the sense that I have a PhD from Yale University. I have been teaching full-time at Boston University since 1984. I'm a tenured faculty member. So I sort of straddle a couple of worlds. I am part of academia. I am a mainstream academic in that sense, but I hold a very different view than some of my colleagues, and I am basing it on the evidence. And the evidence that we have now is that there was what I call a cycle of civilization prior to the end of the last ice age. And the last ice age ended 9,700 BC. And we have evidence. This was first suggested by my early work on the Great Sphinx. We now have a site in southeastern Turkey known as Göbekli Tepe. It was being excavated by Air Professor Klaus Schmidt, Professor Dr. Klaus Schmidt, but he died, unfortunately, very suddenly, very tragic, last year. Yeah, it's horrible. But he was with the German Archaeological Institute, and he had been excavating Göbekli Tepe since 1995, so was that 20 years. And this is a site that shows incredible sophistication. What I can only conclude is civilization the earliest portions of it are prior to 9,700 BC. It actually straddles the end of the last ice age. So this is a very different view than my classical status quo, if I could put it that way, colleagues have. Their paradigm is that civilization, true civilization, did not arise until the 4,000, 3,000 BC period, so 5,000, 6,000 years ago, in really middle and lower Mesopotamia, not northern Mesopotamia where Göbekli Tepe is located, not Egypt where the Proto-Sphinx, I'll call it the Proto-Sphinx, is located. The Proto-Sphinx being the older portions of what we now call the Great Sphinx. The head was recarved, so it's a dynastic head going back 4,500, 5,000 years, but it was recarved on a body that is thousands of years older than that. So there's this earlier cycle of civilization that goes back 9,700 BC, or if you want to translate that into years ago, 11,700, almost 12,000 years ago, roughly 10,000 BC, that we have evidence for.
Yeah, the owner of this web station, this internet radio station, is very happy that you are on. She's posting some stuff from you in the chat room. It says Dr. Schoch has been quoted extensively in the media for his work on ancient cultures and monuments around the globe, including Egypt, Turkey, Bosnia, Romania, Bulgaria, Wales, England, Scotland, Norway, Mexico, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, South Africa and Japan. His research has been instrumental in spurring renewed attention to the interrelationships between geological and astronomical phenomena, natural catastrophes, and the early history of civilization. So you've been around the world, huh?
Yeah, I've been, well, in this business, what I find is that you do have to travel, you do have to take the opportunities when you can. And I found that it's very important to see sites firsthand when I have the ability. At this point, I don't like to comment too extensively, at least, on a site, on a claim, unless I've had a chance to study it firsthand, study both the technical literature and also see what is there on the ground. Because in some cases, people will make claims for certain sites, and you go there, and it's frankly not the case. A classic example of that is Bosnia, where it's just not the case what is being claimed. It's not the case. It doesn't check out. On the other hand, sometimes I find something that is very different than what I expected. And I'll go back to 1990. John Anthony West first got me involved professionally in this in 1990, so that's 25 years ago now, and he asked me to go to Egypt. My first trip to Egypt was in 1990, specifically to study the Great Sphinx. And at that point, I was very much in the standard camp of academia. I thought it was a crazy concept that the Sphinx could have anything other than a 2500 BC origination date, because that's when the Egyptologists said it was built from scratch. And I found that the geological evidence said something very different. Okay. So that got me started. But then I go to other sites sometimes, and we can talk about other sites if you like too.
Sure.
For instance, claims in Bosnia, and I went there and I found that they were, to put it crudely, bogus, that the evidence does not hold up for the claims there. So every case is individual. Every case has to be looked at. And I found that I have to travel to do that in many cases.
Yeah. Is there a connection between the Sphinx and the three big pyramids that they built? Very close to that?
Yeah, I think. Certainly there's a connection, but it depends on what you call a connection. The Great Sphinx, by my determination now, I am comfortable with pushing it back to this earlier cycle of civilization, so we can think in terms of prior to the end of the last ice age, 9700 BC. We can just think in terms of, crudely 10,000 BC. I believe that we can make the argument based on the evidence that the core body very highly eroded at this point, eroded by rain, by precipitation, by water runoff, which you don't see for the last 5,000 plus years because it's Sahara Desert, edge of the Sahara Desert, but it goes back to an earlier climatic regime. And so we have the core body of the Sphinx. And it goes back to a much earlier period. The Sphinx Temple in front of it actually was built at the same time. There are other structures on the Giza Plateau. For instance, the Sphinx, if people don't know, haven't been there or know what it looks like, the Sphinx sits absolutely due east of the second pyramid. There is evidence that the second pyramid, as well as the Great Pyramid, and probably the third pyramid too, the smallest of the three major pyramids, are all built on earlier structures. So you have earlier structures underneath them. Was the entire site used by dynastic Egyptians? Yes, absolutely. I don't deny that the Egyptians were there 2000, 3000 BC, but they took over earlier structures, they rebuilt them, they reused them, they reappropriated them. Not unlike, we have around the world. In, Europe, you go to some ancient, when I say ancient, medieval cathedral, and it has modern repairs on it. People are still using it, yet it goes back 1,000 or more years, perhaps. So they were reusing earlier structures. As I already mentioned, they recarved the head of the Sphinx into a dynastic head. So it's not the original head. The Great Pyramid, for instance, and I've written about this in earlier book, Pyramid Quest, the Great Pyramid, I am convinced, sits on what was, for lack of a better term, a sacred mound that goes well back before dynastic times, thousands of years, may go back to the end of the last ice age as being recognized as a sacred mound. In the Great Pyramid, if you go into the Great Pyramid, you can go up into the Grand Gallery and the King's Chamber, and that's what most people do, and they get very excited about that. But to me, much more exciting is going down the descending passage into what's known as the subterranean chamber in the bedrock, well below the actual pyramid structure. And that, for instance, I'm convinced is a much older structure. They were going down there. In fact, we find caves and underground chambers associated with ancient structures from this earlier cycle, with these very old structures. And so that's older. I was mentioning that we have evidence that the second pyramid is built on top of an older structure, and it's less definitive, but probably third pyramid too. So we have older structures there which are being reused and reused again.
Uh-huh. There's a couple of questions coming up in the chat room. One we will get to, because I really want to let you speak about that also. Jules wants to know about the place in Turkey. He said that it's, you're supposed to have said that it's 11,000 years old and advanced. So that's one thing.
And what?
Advanced.
Yes, very advanced.
Yeah, okay.
It goes back 11,000, 12,000 years. Think in terms of roughly 9,000, 10,000 BC. It spans the end of the last ice age.
Yeah. I want to get back to that. There's another one. Vincent wants to know if you correlate the pyramids in Egypt with those found in Americas.
Yes, to a certain extent. I've written about this, interestingly, in an even earlier book called Voyages of the Pyramid Builders. And I am convinced, this is another story really, but I am convinced that there was contact around the globe in ancient times, that there was transoceanic contact, that ideas, technologies, to a certain extent, part of it was sort of hit and miss, but to a certain extent were communicated around the world. So I don't have any issue with what's sometimes known as a diffusionist point of view, that there were contacts in very ancient times. And I would not, a pyramidal structure from an engineering point of view is a pretty obvious structure if you want to build a great big monument. So I wouldn't base it just on pyramids, and I never have based on just on pyramids. But when you look at other technologies, very specific technologies versus, say, ways to dye, wool, cloth, that type of thing, specific cultural traits, in many cases things that are not so much functional but just aesthetic. When you find, for instance, Shang Dynasty writing in an Olmec context, which is very well, what I want to say is very well described and was excavated by competent archaeologists, so you exclude the possibility that someone was just faking it. You find all these different connections in time. You find what they call Jomon pottery in South and Central America, from Japan. So there's lots of indications that there was transoceanic contact in ancient times. Just recently, papers came out based on genetics of Easter Island. One of the places I'm fascinated by is Easter Island. For a long time, Thor Heyerdahl, the late Thor Heyerdahl, who did a lot of work in this area with his rafts and his reed boats, where he would experimentally see how ancient peoples could traverse the oceans and demonstrate that was possible. He, for a long time, I just give this as one for instance, he for a long time advocated that Easter Island in the middle of the Pacific, essentially in the middle of nowhere, the most remote inhabited place on Earth, literally, he suggested that was not just Polynesian from the west, not just Polynesians that colonized Easter Island, but that there were South American influences, and he demonstrated this culturally through the artwork, through the technology that you find on Easter Island in pre-contact, pre-European contact contexts. And people just dismissed it. The general academic community laughed at him, and he unfortunately died. Well, I mean, everyone dies eventually. He was not young. But he died in 2002, and just in the last year, genetic studies have now come out, and lo and behold, they demonstrate, I believe fairly definitively, or quite definitively, that there is in the Easter Island genetic pool, the native genetic pool, genes, South American genes that shows that, yes, in fact, there was a population coming from South America and helping to colonize Easter Island or interacting with the Easter Islanders, breeding with the Easter Islanders in pre-European times.
Wow.
So, I mean, you know, there's lots of evidence. I was going to say one thing you can trace too is plants and animals and how they have made their way around the globe, and especially domesticates that aren't going just all of a sudden appear in one continent and then another continent without humans having brought them. So there's lots of evidence for transoceanic contact in ancient times. And the more we look at it, the more remote some of this context seems to be, more or less more remote temporally, going back further and further.
Yeah. You went to Turkey, I understand.
Yes, I was in Turkey. Katie, my wife, and I were just in Turkey it's a month before last, June. Today's August 1st now.
Yeah.
But we were just back there looking at Göbekli Tepe in particular, but we've been going back and forth to Turkey now with a specific focus on this incredible site in southeastern Turkey.
Okay.
For a number of years now, because it is so important. And actually, if I could put a little plug in, we do take tours. We do take people there to see these sites also. So if anyone's interested in that, they should check our website or go to my website and be put on the mailing list. Have taken people in the past, because I think it's very important for everyone to see these sites if they're interested and have a, sort of a passion for it as I do. I like to take people to see some of these sites, so I do lead public tours also.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
what exactly is Göbekli Tepe?
Göbekli Tepe's near the city of Urfa. It's, I want to say, 50 or some kilometers north of the Turkish-Syrian border in southeastern Turkey, maybe 60 kilometers, somewhere around there. It's fairly close to the Syrian border. You can actually see the Syrian border from it if you know what you're looking for. You can see water towers, that type of thing.
Okay.
And it's I'm just giving you the location. So it's actually part of northern Mesopotamia. It's near the Euphrates River. It's not on the Euphrates, but it's near the Euphrates River. Interestingly, it's actually northern Mesopotamia. If you read the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament as it's called among Christians generally, this is the land of Eden. It's actually the area where Eden is located. But what you have at Göbekli Tepe is stone circles. That's the best way to introduce it. People can often think of stone circles, they think of Stonehenge. So they think of a circle of standing stones. You have that at Göbekli Tepe, but what you have is a number of stone circles. Approximately 4 plus have been excavated to a great extent by the German Archaeological Institute, working with the local Turkish archaeologists. But there's another 16 or more, there's at least 20 total stone circles in the ground there, which have been found by geophysical means, things like ground penetrating radar, and those, seismic, those types of techniques. Mm-hmm. So it's an incredibly large site. These pillars found at Göbekli Tepe are not small. They range in height from a couple of meters to, say, in the range of 4 to 5 meters. The larger ones are 10 to 15 tons. But I analogize to Stonehenge because people have a visual image of Stonehenge, but there the analogy stops.
Okay.
Because Stonehenge is these huge, crude, rough-hewn stones that have been erected. Göbekli Tepe is anything but crude. The stones at Göbekli Tepe, the pillars at Göbekli Tepe, are known as T-pillars. They look like the letter T, but they're all carved from one piece of stone. Each one is a monolith.
Okay.
And they are beautifully carved. They have sharp edges. They have smooth surfaces. They're not rough-hewn like Stonehenge or other European monuments of the same style as Stonehenge. They're smoothly carved. They're beautifully carved out of limestone, and many of them have reliefs on them.
Oh?
They have carvings on them. Some are anthropomorphic. They actually are humanoid. They have arms. They have hands. They have a belt. They have a loincloth. Others have animals carved on them or scenes carved on them.
Scenes?
Yeah, scenes.
What's that?
One looks like it has little ducks on it and a background of, maybe some kind of setting, landscape. People argue exactly what it represents.
Yeah.
It seemed to have various animals, aurochs, which is a type of wild cattle that's now extinct, cranes, foxes, boars, pigs. When I say boars, wild pigs.
Yeah.
That type of thing. Serpents, snakes, insects, scorpion, vulture. Now, I want to point out that I'm naming all these animals, but I suspect that they're not really animals per se. Or yes, they're animals, but they're animals that represent something else. For instance, they may represent constellations in the sky, or they may tie in with my theory of what ended the last ice age, which was major solar outbursts and configurations that you would see in the sky during a solar outburst. So I think that what is being carved at Göbekli Tepe is very sophisticated, and it's not just decoration per se, but probably when you spend that much time carving this, creating these structures, it probably has a message, at least that was understood and known to the builders, that we have yet to fully interpret or to interpret at all. One thing I would point out, for instance, is that by my determination, so I'm talking about my own work and analysis of Göbekli Tepe, these are aligned. The enclosures, they call it, are the stone circles, have circles around them. Again, think of Stonehenge circles, but each one has a central pair of pillars in the middle, and these seem to be aligned to the sky, and specifically in the range of 10,000 to 9,000 BC, they appear to be aligned on the vernal equinox, by my analysis, to the region of Osiris, Taurus, and the Pleiades, which seems to be a very significant region to many ancient peoples. For instance, my colleague Robert Bouval has determined, and I'm sure a lot of people are aware of this, the so-called Osiris correlation of the three great pyramids, the three major pyramids on the Giza Plateau, that they correlated with Osiris in about 10,000, 10,500 BC. I was actually quite surprised, even embarrassed, when I found that there's a similar correlation at approximately the same time at Göbekli Tepe. That seems to be a very important region of the sky. We have independent evidence, for instance, from Germany and France, that people were recognizing Osiris as the headless hunter. Osiris is a classic constellation, asterism actually, with the belt and the body of the hunter. I'm sorry, when I said Osiris, I'm thinking in the Egyptian terms, Orion. Yeah. So they seem to point to Orion, the Orion correlation on the Giza Plateau, the Orion correlation that I found at Göbekli Tepe, and Orion and Osiris are the same figure, basically, when it comes to Egypt. So that's why I was saying Orion,
Yeah.
Osiris. And then Taurus. So we have Orion as a hunter figure in Germany, for instance, on Mammoth Bone, going back apparently 30,000 or more years. We have evidence of Taurus going back at least 15 plus thousand years in some of the cave art, that type of thing, as a bull with the Pleiades associated with Taurus, and these are all in the same basic region of the sky. And it may have to do with some of the early creation myths. It may have to do with things that were literally happening in the skies that affected humans here on Earth. So it's a very, very interesting.
Yeah. So the belts on the stones in Göbekli Tepe, they would tie to the belt of Orion?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, what's known technically as Enclosure D, which dates back before 9700 BC by my analysis, just before that, and so existed at the very end of the last ice age. The central pillars of Enclosure D are these huge anthropomorphic headless figures, but they have arms, they have hands, they have an incredibly beautiful belt with a fox pelt loincloth, and I believe that they may well represent Orion in the sky with the belt stars. The stars of Orion are a very classic asterism.
Yeah. So when you study stones, how do you determine how old it is?
That's a very difficult thing. Most stone, there's two questions here, just to make it clear to everyone. You can determine the age of the actual stone when it formed, and usually that has no applicability whatsoever to an archaeological site. So, for instance, when you look at the stones of Egypt, what the stones that the Sphinx is carved out of, I mean, they're Eocene, they're tens of millions of years old. Sometimes people get very frustrated with me because there's one fellow, he found a sea urchin in Giza, and he says, oh, this ties in with my theory that it was flooded with water, and then they build up scenarios about how the sea was there. Well, yeah, the sea was there millions of years ago because these are limestones that formed in an ancient ocean, and there are fossils there, but that has nothing to do with the archaeological site.
Yeah.
So what the real issue is when were they carved? When were they formed into an archaeological site?
Yeah.
So in the case of the Sphinx, my early work on the Sphinx, I looked at once the structure was carved, how was it weathered? How was it eroded? How long would it take to weather and erode it to the point where we see it today? What climatic regime would it have to be exposed to? And then you can tie it in with the paleoclimatology, for instance, and figure out what period it must have been carved in or carved before that period to have been weathered and eroded to the way we see it now. So that's one type of technique. Another technique with Göbekli Tepe, for instance, is Göbekli Tepe was... So Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey that we were just talking about was purposefully buried by the ancient people. And we know this because it was not just left to the elements. It was not a site that was simply abandoned by ancient people. They purposefully covered over, they purposefully buried it. You can see this with the stratigraphy, that is the layers of rocks. And what you can then do is try to date when it was covered over, because layers of rock and soil were put in there by the people. It includes some carbon fragments. You can radiocarbon date those. Also, you can radiocarbon date what different minerals that form. So they would precipitate, they would form. Think of little... If you go into a limestone cave, little stalactites and stalagmites, those actually formed in the debris that was used to cover over Göbekli Tepe after it was covered over. So it gives you an end date of it must have been covered over by such and such a date. That date is about 8,000 plus BC. So we know it was totally covered over 10,000 years ago.
Okay.
Everything in there must be older. Another way we can date things, I'll go back to the Sphinx, is you can look at subsurface weathering. For instance, fellow geophysicist Dr. Thomas DeBecke and I in the early 1990s looked at subsurface mineralogical changes, subsurface weathering around the base of the Sphinx, which allowed us, depending on the depth of that weathering, to calibrate when that surface must have first been exposed. So there are a number of ways you can try to date things.
You mentioned radiocarbon dating minerals.
Yeah.
Those minerals, how did these minerals come to be?
Well, in the case of Göbekli Tepe, what I was referring to is once the site was completely covered over, you have a lot of limestone.
Yeah.
As you have, and when I say limestone, fragments of limestone in the soil. Think of it that way, little pebbles, little rocks, that type of thing. Limestone weathers, limestone dissolves rainwater to a very slight extent. People that live in big cities, especially with acid rain, that type of thing, may well be aware of this, particularly if they're ancient or antique sculptures, say on a cathedral, that type of thing made out of limestone, that they may look like they're running and melting literally, which they are. So what happens is, even with natural, before modern pollution, with natural rainwater, it is slightly acidic. It will dissolve the limestone.
Yeah.
And think of it on a microscopic level. Then it reprecipitates. The limestone reprecipitates as calcium carbonate. This is what happens in limestone caves to produce the wonderful formations that we see, the stalactites and stalagmites. And when it reprecipitates, it includes modern carbon in it. So you can actually use that to date, to radiocarbon date.
Oh, so you're dating the carbon, not the minerals.
Yeah. Well, no, it's a carbon. Yeah, you're dating the carbon, but that dates the minerals because the carbon was captured when the mineral formed.
Aha.
Yeah, because the mineral is calcium carbonate mineral, for instance, calcite, is capturing the carbon, and so by dating the carbon that's been captured, you're dating it when the mineral formed.
So, but the mineral could be older than the carbon, then?
No, because the mineral is crystalline structure made out of atoms, and so when it captures those atoms and forms the crystalline structure, so you're dating when it captured those atoms, so you're dating when it crystallized.
Okay, I see. I understand. Yeah. Do you mind if I take 2 questions from the chat room?
Oh, you can take as many as you like.
Well, I want to get to the sun, I know you want to talk about that, but there's one question about the pyramids. Were they a kind of terminal for a form of Earth battery?
Who knows?
Okay.
There are all these theories about what the pyramids did and what they were for, and if I understand correctly, sort of like an Earth energy type thing.
That's what I understand also. I saw one video about it with water running beneath the pyramids, but, I just don't know.
Some people claim it was Earth battery, or it was focusing energy, that type of thing. The Great Pyramid does, and other pyramids too, I suppose, do focus static electricity, that type of thing. But any large structure may well do that. It's properly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that's one case. I mean, this gets into the whole issue of what the function of the pyramids for, why were they built, and there's probably no single answer. There's probably multiple functions, if you would, of the pyramids. Certainly in dynastic times they were, I shouldn't say certainly, but I think there's a strong possibility in dynastic times they were used for initiation purposes, that type of thing, ritualistic purposes, but I doubt if that was the original function.
Yeah.
I talk about in my own work, Pyramid Quest, I talk about the theory, which goes back to a guy named Richard Proctor in the late 19th century, that the Great Pyramid was initially built only to the 50th level. The Grand Gallery actually opened out to the night sky. Its perfectly aligned north-south, well, within a very small fraction of a degree north-south, as well as anyone could align anything until a mere 100 years ago. We didn't even know how, we couldn't measure how accurately it was aligned. And it's beautifully aligned, and you have this passage, if it was open, as there's lots of evidence, I believe that it was, for a time period to the southern sky, it would make a great astronomical observatory for mapping very, very accurately stellar and planetary positions. So it probably had astronomical, astrological functions, if you would, that type of thing. Going back further, why did they carve into the, quote, sacred mound that underlies the pyramid at a very remote period, well before dynastic times? Well, one thing that was happening at the end of the last ice age, based on the evidence I put together, is that the last ice age was ended by a major solar outburst that essentially snapped us out of this cold period very dramatically, but would have been cataclysmic, literally on the surface of the Earth. And the best way to survive events like that would be to go underground into either natural caves and or artificial caves. And you find around the world caves, and both artificial and natural, associated with very, very ancient cultures, going back to this, what I call the earlier cycle of civilization. So I think there are multiple issues involved with the Great Pyramid.
Yeah.
I'd say an example of that is Cappadocia in Turkey, where I've visited a number of times and actually taken people on tours that I've led, where you have these incredible underground cities. I was just back there, Katie and I were just back there in June, looking at it once again, and there you have, for instance, ancient cities that could hold thousands, even tens of thousands of people. They just found a new one that is the largest so far, but there's literally hundreds of small and large underground cities. You have, and Giza, a huge underground complex of tunnels, not just the Great Pyramid.
Oh.
Yeah, so, I mean, there's a lot of interesting, strange things going on, if you would.
Yeah. Another question from the chat is, what do you think of Pumapunku?
Pumapunku is very interesting. I've certainly been there to take a look at firsthand. South America, honestly, it has not. I've not spent as much time analyzing in depth the South American. I've been there a number of times, but I've, you can only spread yourself, do so much.
Yeah.
In so much time, so I'm not sure exactly what to make of Puma and Tiwanaku there. Certainly related. You have a situation there, just to fill in people, that there's evidence that the standard status quo story is that, you're only talking centuries or a couple of thousand years. The work that has been done, especially in the 30s and 40s, some of the early work, was that there may be astronomical alignments there that would push us back into the end of the last ice age, the same period I'm talking about. Other sites where I'm absolutely convinced, but right now I don't want to be definitive about Tiwanaku, Pumapunku. They're actually related to each other. Incredible sophistication there. There's no doubt that it breaks from the standard story, but as far as how far back it goes, I think it still needs a lot more work. There's some evidence, for instance, or there's evidence that's been put forth that it was connected to the sea, that you had cataclysmic changes, where it's now high in the Andes. But that, it still needs a lot more investigation, I think, to come to a definitive answer. And when I think something is not definitive yet, I will say so, just like I'm saying right now.
That's very good. I was wondering myself about an ice age. So, like, for instance, before the ending of the last ice age, how do I imagine the world? Is it fully iced?
No. It's certainly not fully iced.
Okay.
It's something that a lot of people don't realize. you had ice in higher latitudes, especially in the northern hemisphere. So right now I am in Boston. I'm speaking from Boston, Massachusetts. At the height of the last ice age, we happen to be covered with ice here in Boston. There would have been several kilometers of ice where I'm sitting now, so I would be crushed to death. Either there, I'd have to sit on top of the ice, I suppose.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, other parts of the world, the ice did not necessarily come down to such low latitudes. It advanced, it retreated, etc. For instance, at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, it was not covered with ice during the ice age. It was actually a much more mild climate, much more temperate climate than you have now there. Now, at least when you go in summer, it means it's really hot. It was. I apologize. What was the temp? I'm trying to think what the temperature was in centigrade. It was over 120 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow, that's over 40 Celsius, I think.
Yeah. It was very hot at one point when we were there, but that's how it is. But it's a dry heat, so you don't feel it so much. But during the Ice Age, for instance, the end of the last Ice Age, when this ancient civilization inhabited the area, it would have been much more moderate, much more amenable climatically, more moisture, more wildlife, more plant life, that type of thing. So Ice Age doesn't necessarily mean that it was less hospitable, depending on where you were in the world. And then, of course, you had cultures and species that went extinct with the end of the Ice Ages, or before the end of the last Ice Age, that were widely and fully adapted, apparently, to Ice Age conditions. So, what is good for one is not necessarily good for another. I think of the Neanderthals, the classic Neanderthals, who were an Ice Age human species. And apparently very well adapted to living in the colder regime of Western and, well, not just Western Europe, certainly Western, Eastern Europe, Central Europe. For instance, in Romania, where I've spent some time looking at such things, they flourished in what is now Romania in the Ice Age. But when environmental conditions changed, it wasn't so good for Neanderthals. It was better for other species and other cultures.
Okay. And how long did the last Ice Age last?
Oh, I don't know. It came and Ice Ages tend to be about roughly 100,000 years at a shot.
Okay.
And what you have to realize, though, is that there's interstadials, they call it, and that type of thing. More or less, it's not just continuous cold. It can get warmer, it can get colder, get warmer, colder. And the end of our last Ice Age is very interesting in this respect, because it was starting to warm up slowly, sort of gradually. Then you have what's known as the Younger Dryas at the very end of our last Ice Age, and that was essentially a 1,200 or so year cold snap, where it got very cold again, about 10,900 BC. That lasted about 1,200 years. I'm basing the dating on Greenland stratigraphy. Other people sometimes will cite slightly different dates based on other stratigraphy, other analysis, but I'm happy with the ones I'm citing. So it got cold about 10,900 BC, so there was a cold snap that started then, lasted about 1,200 years until the dramatic warming in 9,700 BC, when it just snapped us literally out of the last Ice Age. So that was very recent from a geological point of view.
Yeah. The link between Ice Ages and the Sun seems to be there.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I'm convinced. I'm convinced that in a very big sense, the Ice Ages and coming and goings of Ice Ages really has a lot to do with the Sun. And there's even evidence that sort of a solar standstill, if you would, or solar decline can induce ice ages can induce things like the Younger Dryas very quickly, very dramatically, and then really snapping out of the ice age, especially the last ice age, I think was a major solar outburst. There's a lot of isotope data and other data suggesting that the sun had a huge solar outburst and dramatically warmed the climate.
Well, what is isotope data? What is that?
The isotope data, what we have in various sediment cores, and particularly ice cores, that type of thing. You get various isotopes. Beryllium is one in particular. Carbon is another major one, certain isotopes of carbon. And these form and correlate. They're basically a proxy for solar activity because as the sun gives off more or less activity, it affects the amount of cosmic rays that come into our atmosphere. That affects these isotopes that form in the atmosphere and then eventually, we'll call it, precipitate out onto the surface, and you can measure those. And something that's very interesting is a lot of people for a long time, when I say a lot of people, both general lay people and scientists, thought that the sun does not vary enough in intensity and output, at least over the last few million years, does not vary enough to have much effect on the climate of the Earth at all. They would say, oh, the sun varies so little, it can't affect climate change on Earth. But that's not true. And there's a couple of factors that are involved. One, our sun is another star. It's a star. And we know that stars go through, we know that stars now, like the sun, go through periods of stability and relative instability, and they go into essentially disequilibrium periodically, then they sort of re-equilibrate. So they go through various periods, and just because we haven't seen much in the last few thousand years doesn't mean that that's the way the sun has always been for all of eternity. The second factor is that it's more complex than the sun just giving off more or less energy. It gives off things like the solar wind. When it's slightly more active or much more active, there's lots of different scenarios. It pushes away cosmic radiation, these cosmic rays, particles that come from deep outer space. When it pushes them away, less clouds form because there's a correlation with cloud formation and cosmic rays coming in, because cosmic rays can nucleate, basically form the nuclei for little droplets for clouds. So you get very complex interactions that when you push away the cosmic rays, when the sun does that, we get more energy coming into the system. It warms. When the sun is less active, you get more cosmic rays coming into the atmosphere, more clouds, which has a cooling effect. So very, very complex system. And it's not so simple to say, well, the sun doesn't vary enough to not affect the climate. I mean, the sun varies, and it's now, I believe, been well established that the sun varies, and the variation in solar activity correlates with climatic changes on Earth.
Does this have to do with sunspots?
Oh, yeah. Sunspots tie in quite a bit, and sunspots are often used as a general indication of solar activity. What you have to realize, though, is that even when the sun, it doesn't have a lot of spots and it seems to be, quote, shutting down, or there seems to be a lack of solar activity, all of a sudden you can have a big one forming and you can have a major solar outburst. So right now, so you also have to be careful not to look at short-term data and extrapolate too far from it. So right now, the sun is doing weird things as far as I'm concerned. And when I say right now, I'm talking about the last few decades. Even the last few years. It seems to be very active. It's actually, there are indications it's gotten as active or getting as active as it ever has been in the last 12,000 years, more or less since the end of the last ice age. It may be ramping up to do something similar to what we saw at the end of the last ice age, which can actually be pretty scary. Because if it has a major solar outburst, we would wipe out modern technology, we would wipe out our computers and our electrical grid systems, that type of thing. And there is precedent for this in that in 1859, and I talk about this extensively in my book, Forgotten Civilization. So my book, Forgotten Civilization, is not just about ancient civilizations. It's actually about modern lessons we need to learn from ancient civilizations in history and apply it to modern times. In 1859, there was what was a minor solar outburst from an astrophysical perspective, major from a human perspective. It's known as the Carrington Event. So this is 1859 in the middle 19th century. And the thing about it is in 1859, we were not a heavily electrified electronic society. The most we had from a functional point of view were telegraphs. The telegraph had been introduced, for instance, in the UK and parts of Europe and parts of America, and the telegraph lines were literally fried, destroyed by this solar outburst because of the electrical charges that came in, the geomagnetic storms that were produced. People saw in the sky things that looked like the aurora borealis, the northern lights, sort of, but sometimes they say America on steroids, magnified to a great extent, much stronger than they'd ever been observed in the past. They saw what looked like dancing figures in the sky, dancing humanoid-shaped figures, sort of looked like stick figures, and it just destroyed the crude telegraph and electrical system of the time. If we had a Carrington event now in 2015 or going forward in the 21st century, it would devastate modern technological society. It would knock out grid systems, electrical grid systems. It would blow transformers. It would knock out our communication systems. If it happened now, we wouldn't be speaking here over Skype.
Yeah.
It would knock out the internet. It would just be absolutely devastating to modern society. And I think this is a very real possibility. And interestingly, the Carrington event, when you had this major solar outburst, it was actually during a solar cycle that, for all intents and purposes, was fairly mundane. There was no indication it was coming until it happened. Yeah, so we have to be very careful. Right now, it seems that the sun, by my analysis, and not just my analysis, other people too, seems to be in a very volatile situation. It seems to be in a very erratic situation. It seems like it is going through a period of instability, and we have to be careful. And some people have been saying, oh, the sun is shutting down, we're going to go into a mini ice age.
Yeah.
May be quiet at the moment, but to use the cliche, this may be the calm before the storm. That it could literally explode with a solar outburst. And if that hits us, there was actually a solar outburst a few years ago, which if it fortunately for us, for modern society, was directed away from Earth, but not very far away. And if we had been slightly different place in our orbit by a week or two, we would have been hit by it. If
that's a near miss.
Near miss. If that had happened, again, you and I would not be talking now because it would have devastated modern electronics and electrical systems, and I don't believe that we would have been able to get back up and running as a society to the point where we'd be having a Skype chat today.
Is there not a possibility with our technology today to detect such a solar?
No. Well, yes and no. Only your detection is going to be a matter of at most days that it's coming in.
Okay, and then shutting down things wouldn't help?
It depends. When you have a solar outburst, you usually, as far as we know, because we haven't experienced many of these in modern times to have data on it, you probably have a major solar flare that comes in at the speed of light. Then you have what are called plasma, electrically charged particles. You can think of a big ball of particles coming in. So that travels at incredible speeds, but not close to the speed of light. That can take, depending on how fast it travels, a couple of days, to get to us.
Yeah.
So you see the flash of light. You then know that it's sometimes called coronal mass ejection, is coming in towards Earth.
Yep.
So maybe we have a couple of days before the big one hits. That's what we saw with the Carrington event in 1859. But there's not complete records of the Carrington event because they didn't have the sensitive magnetometers, the sensitive equipment that we now have to measure all the different aspects of it.
Yeah.
So it's something that we really, as a society, need to be looking at and taking seriously, and tying back with ancient civilizations. This happened, I'm convinced, to end the last ice age, and so we have an ancient cycle of civilization represented by Göbekli Tepe, for instance, that experienced such catastrophe. Now, they were a very different type of society than us, but it was devastating to them. And if it happens, or when it happens, I hate to be pessimistic, but when it happens again, it's going to be devastating to us if we haven't made some kind of advanced preparations.
Yeah. So at Göbekli Tepe, there are, I've heard, 22 or more stone circles. Is that correct?
Somewhere in that range, yeah.
Yeah.
20 or more.
Why so many?
Well, I don't know. I mean, that's one of the things. We're looking at a really huge, complex site. And we don't fully understand it. What was Göbekli Tepe? We don't even know what Göbekli Tepe was.
Okay.
What the archaeologists, the standard archaeologists, say when they even talk about, because it's a real sort of issue for certain archaeologists, because they don't want to admit that it really changes the playing field, as they say. It really challenges the paradigm, the standard paradigm. And often what they call it, in fact, I hate this personally, because I think it doesn't do justice to the people who built Göbekli Tepe.
Yeah.
They say it's the world's first temple. Well, how do they know it's a temple? Why do they call it a temple? Because the standard archaeologists, and I don't need to be nasty here, but I am being a little nasty. I'm being honest.
That's okay.
The standard archaeologist, if you don't know what something is, you don't know what a structure is, you either call it a temple, or if you find some burial there, you call it a tomb.
Yeah.
The world is not that simple. Did it have maybe some religious purposes? Yeah, sure, possibly. Is there some evidence of human bone being found there as little fragments? Yeah, but that doesn't mean it's just a temple.
Yeah.
Even when we look at our modern, when I say modern, I'm thinking as a geologist, when we look at medieval society, for instance, European Middle Ages and high Middle Ages going to the Renaissance, church and science and museums and universities were all interconnected. So I often think of Göbekli Tepe as sort of being a /museum, university, center of learning, something where they were working on understanding the world around them, probably making astronomical observations, as I mentioned before, tying it in with bigger picture. One thing we find with ancient societies is that I believe many of them were much more attuned to natural cycles, much more attuned to the bigger picture, grander scheme of things than we are in modern society. I'm speaking from America, and here so many Americans, all they can think about is the election cycle of the president, which is only 4 years. They think beyond 4 years.
Yeah.
It's absolutely ridiculous, versus here you had civilizations in the past that were thinking in terms of thousands of years. And looking at precessional cycles, for instance, which we have evidence of at Göbekli Tepe, and the precessional cycle is about 24 to 26,000 year cycle.
Yeah.
Going through the different ages. Just so people know what we're talking about, we're in the age of Aries now, going to the age, age of Pisces now. What am I saying? I think as a geologist, we were in the age of Aries, then we entered the age of Pisces about 2,000 years ago, and we're now going to the age of Aquarius.
Yeah.
And before the age of Aries was the age of Taurus, et cetera, et cetera. So we go through these ages, and this is very slow, very methodical, but we have direct evidence, I believe, at Göbekli Tepe, that they were realigning their stone circles with precession, as things went out of sync in precession, which may be part of the answer to why there are so many, because they did not last forever, because they would go out of alignment and they'd have to realign them.
Wow.
And the four that have been excavated so far, I talk about this in my book, I believe show straightforward evidence that they were realigning due to precessional changes.
Yeah. So that's 26,000 years. That would mean that there had to have been, or that's just a suggestion here, but that there had to have been a civilization that lasted at least that long, right?
Yeah. I think we are looking at the just the very tip, if you would, of the end of a sophisticated civilization that lasted a very long time. We're not looking at origins of what we have at Göbekli Tepe right now. I think is the end, and it was devastated by what happened at the end of the last ice age. The solar outburst, the climatic changes, the catastrophic changes on Earth. I want to mention that we're talking real catastrophic changes on Earth at the end of the last ice age, because you had the sudden melting of huge glaciers in high latitudes, kilometers thick worth of ice that would relieve pressure or take pressure off of the crust, which causes earthquake activity, causes increased volcanic activity. This is something that we know happens geologically. So this would have had a cascading effect of geologic volcanic activity. Also with the solar outbursts, in some cases you'd have essentially what would be like, you could think of as huge lightning bolts hitting the surface of the Earth, causing literally incineration on the surface of the Earth in localized areas, probably set wildfires in some areas, would have evaporated huge amounts of water, not just from glaciers, but also from bodies of liquid water, oceans or lakes, that type of thing. You would dump put all kinds of moisture in the atmosphere. The atmosphere can only hold so much, so you would have torrential rains coming down. As glaciers were melting, sea levels were rising. This combined with torrential rain and local flooding, it really would have been a very devastating situation. So these cataclysmic changes were real at the end of the last ice age, and they had a devastating effect on this early civilization, which came back to Göbekli Tepe. What we see, what's been excavated so far, seems to be the end of Göbekli Tepe.
Yeah.
But the sophistication we see, there would have been a lot of time, I believe, that would lead up to that. So, this was probably a civilization that existed for thousands and thousands of years, or built up to the end point that we see. It's not a beginning, it's a real culmination.
Yeah. There's the contradiction in my head now regarding where do humans come from, right?
No. You elaborate, because I have to know where you're coming from.
Well, I've always doubted things that I've been told at school, because they didn't seem to make sense to me.
Yeah, well, that's okay. A lot of
So I don't know. When you ask me where do humans come from, I just say I don't know. But the idea of Neanderthals come to mind, and Cro-Magnon,
Yeah.
Does there seem to be different types of humans living at the same time together, or?
Yeah, actually, this is an interesting topic because until very recently, and maybe even very recently, there were more than one species of human on Earth simultaneously.
Huh.
So Neanderthals, I'm convinced. I mean, I have training in vertebrate paleontology and paleoanthropology, skeletal anatomy, that type of thing. And it's hard to tell based on just skeletons, of course, but I personally am convinced that Neanderthals were a different species than us. There may have been some interbreeding, and when you have closely related species, you can have a certain amount of interbreeding, but Neanderthals were probably a different species when it comes right down to it. They went extinct. At other points in the more remote past, we have good evidence that in some cases there were half a dozen different species of humans living on Earth simultaneously.
Yeah.
It seems to be an anomaly that on Earth right now we have only, as far as we know, one species of human. And I actually say as far as we know very specifically because I want to bring up two interesting topics here. I think they're interesting. In Indonesia, on the island of Flores, was found just earlier this century. So when I say earlier this century, in the last 10 years or so, something known as Homo floresiensis, which was a separate and distinct species of human known from fossil evidence, and it was a little diminutive human. Sometimes it's referred to as the hobbits, and this was a species of human where they stood maybe 3.5 feet high, a meter or so high.
Yeah.
And that was when they were fully grown, maybe slightly higher, but they were a separate, distinct species. And what's really interesting is that they existed at the end of the last ice age, not very long ago from a geological point of view. 15,000 years ago or so, they were still around. They were alive. They were coexisting with our species.
Yeah, yeah.
And in fact, they may have existed even much later than that, because actually you're coming from the Netherlands, aren't you?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, yeah. My part of my family is from the Netherlands.
Yeah, your last name does suggest something like that.
Yeah. My part of my family, my family's basically what we call in America Dutch. My grandmother always referred to us as not really Dutch, but Netherlandish or whatever the term might be, and German. But my point is that the what we call in America the Dutch, the Dutch East Indies, they were trading in Indonesia. Those sailors, those admirals, even they brought back all kinds of ethnographic material and I'll call it stories, but I don't mean to dismiss it that way. And one of the things they brought back was that in what we now call Indonesia, there were stories told by the locals as late as the 18th, early 19th century that there was a race of little people that lived up in the hills that would come down sometimes and raid their villages, steal their babies, that type of thing. And this was absolutely dismissed by all modern, anthropologists. But now we have evidence that there was this species, Homo floresiensis, and given the nature of Indonesia, most bones are not preserved. It's a tropical type environment. And is it possible that this species existed even as recently as a couple of hundred years ago? I don't think that's impossible at all. Is it possible, this is really wild to think about, is it possible that somewhere on some remote island, do they still exist?
Yeah.
No, it's not totally impossible. Now comes another thing I want to bring, and this gets back to the Dutch too. Katie and I, my wife, Katie and I, have a love for Easter Island, and we've been there a couple of times. We were actually married on Easter Island in the Pacific, and it's called Easter Island because it was discovered or first sighted on Easter Sunday by a Dutch expedition in 1722.
Okay.
Now, where this ties in is that there were first-hand accounts that when they first found the island, that there were, quote, giants on the island. And they were the men were said to be 12 feet tall, the women were 10 feet tall, and the men at least were tall enough that they could stand, when they were standing, if they spread their legs slightly, the sailors could walk between their legs without so, and again, anthropologists dismiss this as just total nonsense and just sailors' tall tales. And then I talked to one anthropologist about it, and he said, oh, yeah, that was probably true, but that his explanation was they were standing on stilts.
Yeah, sure.
My relatives, my heritage, they were not so stupid that they couldn't recognize when someone was standing on stilts.
Yeah.
And they even talk about them, they row out in little boats. I doubt if you do that standing on stilts.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense.
To make matters even more interesting, we actually met and stayed with someone who's a native of Easter Island who said, yeah, as a child, he had seen big human bones in a cave on Easter Island that seemed to tie in. So is there evidence that there were a race of giants still on Easter Island? At least when I say race, at least a few representatives as late as the 18th century. I at this point I wouldn't base a lot on that, but I wouldn't dismiss it either. And this ties in with my work and my theory that on Easter Island, you may have had a population that was isolated and preserved from very, very, very ancient times. Yeah. So the classic story with Easter Island is that it wasn't colonized. No one lived there until maybe, depending on who you talk to among the status quo archaeologists, they will give you 500 AD to 1200 AD, but very late.
Yeah.
There's actually been recent work that pushes that back at least twice as far in time, twice as far back in time. But I've speculated that, in fact, it may have been colonized much, much earlier than that. And interesting on Easter Island, I wanted to mention this briefly, and I talked about it in Forgotten Civilization. On Easter Island, it's the only Pacific island that has its own indigenous script. It's called the Rongo script. It's sort of a hieroglyphic-looking script. But what I believe, and Katie, my wife, actually first discovered this, is that it looks very similar to what are known as petroglyphs that have been found around the world. Petroglyphs are drawings on rocks, carvings on rocks. You can think of it as sort of, most of them are very crude, sort of scratchings on rocks. And these petroglyphs have been studied by plasma physicists out of Los Alamos National Laboratory named Anthony Perrott, Dr. Anthony Perrott, and he came to the conclusion that they represent what you would see in the sky, what people recorded seeing in the sky during a major solar outburst in antiquity. And the Rongo seems to record the same thing, and this all ties back to the concept that a major solar outburst destroyed earlier cycle of civilization at the end of the last ice age.
Yeah. These are the humanoid-like scribes. What do you call them? The form of the glyphs is like humanoid,
the
right?
Glyphs, they sort of look like humanoid figures.
Yeah.
And they a lot of them, but they have very distinctive features, diagnostic features. They look like they have big hands holding them up. A lot of them look like they have birds' heads, so they look like bird-headed humans. And interestingly, if you look at very ancient civilizations around the world, one of the motifs that you see over and over are these hybrid bird-headed human figures. And it may all go back to the end of the last ice age and what people were seeing in the sky. And, a lot of times when we look at things in the sky, whether it's clouds or anything else, we tend to anthropomorphize. We put in terms that we are familiar with. And even in 1859, during the Carrington event, they talked about seeing what looked like human figures in the sky. They also saw what they looked like hands in the sky, waving hands in the sky. But the whole concept of a birdman is something that you find around the world, but particularly on Easter Island. They have a whole cult of the birdman, which may go back to what they were seeing in the sky during a major solar outburst in plasma configurations that would look like literally humans with bird heads. You have that in Egypt too, for instance. A very strong motif. Horus, the son of Osiris, is often represented as a human with a bird's head.
Yeah, I'm looking at Robert Schoch and then plasma.
Oh yeah, on my website, robertschoch.com, and I forget what it's called. I'm not looking at it now, but a plasma page.
Yeah, plasma.html. There's the Easter Island Rongo tablet in detail.
Yeah. So I think this is just one more line of evidence, in this case archaeological evidence, that we had a major plasma outburst. And Dr. Perrott, you may see it on the page there. I don't know if it's there, or I've certainly talked about in the book. He distinguished three major sort of categories of plasma configurations that you see in petroglyphs, and you see all of those represented in the Rongo and elsewhere. You have bird-headed men, you have what look like stick figures of humans with dots on their sides, or what's known as a torus on their sides, which, real humans don't have that. And then you have sort of cascading cylindrical type figures, and all of these you find repeated over and over around the world. He's actually studied these in 130 plus countries around the world, ancient petroglyphs. And they're all aligned the same way because they would have been looking at the same part of the sky. So I think it makes a very powerful argument on top of everything else, the geological evidence and the archaeological evidence otherwise, that something very traumatic happened at the end of the last ice age, 9700 BC.
And so this plasma came from the sun?
Yes, it would have come from the sun, because think of the sun spews out, it's called the solar wind on a regular basis. It spews out particles, but there are major solar outbursts. The best way to think of it is like a big ball of gas being expelled by the sun, sort of shooting out of the sun. It's known as a coronal mass ejection because it's a mass that comes from the corona of the sun, the layer of the sun, and it shoots off into space. And if Earth or any other planet is in the way, it hits that planet.
Yeah.
And that's what happened at the end of the last ice age. That is what happened in 1859. A very small one astrophysically hit us. And that is what inevitably is going to hit us again. And one thing that's very important is that this ball of gas is not really gas, it's plasma, which is another form of matter. What we think of on Earth is normally solid, liquids, and gases. There's the three states of matter. Yeah. Well, the fourth state, which is really charged particles.
Okay.
Charged particles, generally in outer space, moving very quickly, but you can think of charged particles, basically atoms stripped of their electrons flowing. Plasma, it's said that most of the universe actually is plasma when it comes right down to it. The vast majority of the universe is plasma. When you have a fluorescent light, what's making it fluoresce, what's making the light is actually a plasma inside the tube or the bright portion of the light.
Okay.
So this is, think of it as these charged particles, often they refer to as a gas, but it's really a ball of charged particles that hits Earth, and when it interacts with the magnetosphere of the Earth, It causes what are known as geomagnetic storms. It causes flashes of light in the sky. This is what gives you things like the northern lights and the southern lights. And it would interact with any kind of electrical systems on Earth. We have in America and around the world, you have lines, electrical grids, power lines, both underground and above ground. These would act as huge antenna picking up these electromagnetic radiations, electromagnetic fields, and it will overload them. It will blow transformers. It will back up and damage power systems, electrical power systems. We had a small one in 1989, a small solar storm like this that hit Quebec and caused a blackout for millions of people for a number of hours. That was a very small one.
Yeah.
If we knock out grid systems, here's something that we're very concerned with. When I say we, people who are in the know about these things, if you knock out electrical grid systems, if you knock out power, you lose power. Ironically, a number of power stations that create power would be damaged. What is used around the world, unfortunately, in my opinion, for generating electrical power, nuclear power, nuclear power plants. Nuclear power plants, if they lose electricity, ironically, they start to have problems. They can't cool themselves. They can't. Everyone knows about Fukushima and what happened with Fukushima.
Well, yeah, there's different theories going around in the scene that we call ourselves the awake people, right? Yeah. Like I, for instance, don't believe that the earthquake actually did damage those. They were built to withstand earthquakes like that. So,
but that's not my point. My point is, if you have a power plant that's damaged and shut down, with earthquake or anything else, we can argue about what caused. I'm not even arguing. We can discuss. Have different theories. The point is, something happened to Fukushima and start leaking radiation.
Yeah.
If we have power shut down to over 400 nuclear power plants, commercial power plants around the world, or even just a few of them, you're going to have radiation leaks all over the place.
Yeah, that's
so there's lots of issues involved. People that live in cities, I live in Boston. We have an underground subway system that will flood I wouldn't say immediately, but very quickly, because they have to have electric pumps to pump water out of it because it's below the water table. People that live in high-rise buildings, they're not going to be able to get up and down because elevators aren't going to work. Water is not going to work because it's not going to be pumped. It just goes on and on, the devastation. Economic devastation, you're going to lose power to computers. You're probably going to fry a lot of computers and computer systems. Most transactions now, economic transactions, most money, most currency is nothing more than electric chips.
Yeah.
Computers, that's all going to be lost. I mean, the problem, my point right now is that we have made ourselves as a society incredibly vulnerable to something like this.
Yeah.
So I don't want to be a scaremonger, but
no, it's okay to talk about those things. My audience is not easily scared, so don't worry about it.
Yeah.
I was talking to a colleague of mine at my work about global warming, and I said I don't believe that it is man-made, and he called me a non-believer. Do you get that kind of ad hominems also thrown at you?
Yeah, you are a non-believer. But in fact, I think that's great because to me, you don't want to be a quote believer because what does a quote believer mean? It means that you're believing something without any evidence necessarily. You're just taking it on faith. And my working ideal for myself, at least, is I don't quote believe anything without evidence for it. When I look at the evidence for global warming, I have found that there's a very strong correlation between climate change, global warming, and solar activity.
Yeah.
And there is a huge industry right now that is built upon the premise that global climate change, global warming specifically, in the last few decades, in the last century, is based on anthropogenic changes. It's based on human-induced changes. And there's a huge industry. There is not even billions, I guess, trillions of dollars tied up with that. And it is dependent on people believing that global warming is caused by humans. So if you don't believe that, you are threatening that paradigm. You are threatening a huge complex of industries and economics, and it has a huge cascading effect. I know that people can get fired from universities if they're not tenured for denying global warming caused by humans. They can lose grants, that type of thing. So there's a lot more going on than just science and the facts of science. When you look at the actual facts, here's my assessment. Most of climate change that we know about has nothing to do with human aspects. It was not being caused by humans. I'm a geologist. We have had changes in climate. We've had ice ages and interglacials, with major changes in climate for millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, billions of years, and they weren't caused by humans doing anything. There are other aspects to it.
Yeah.
Recently, when I say recently, an argument can be made that in the last couple of decades, the changes in climate are tied intimately over the last, say, century or two with changes in solar activity. And very, very recently, there is an argument to be made that putting greenhouse gases, that type of thing, in excess into the atmosphere may be exacerbating certain aspects of climate change.
Yeah.
So there may be a slight human component, but it's certainly, in my opinion, not the driving factor. Does that make sense?
Well, absolutely, especially since water vapor is the most
water vapor is a major greenhouse gas, and we don't really have any control over that. So the bottom line is it's a much more complex situation than to say you're a believer or a denier, global warming denier or believer. And for people to try to put it into a black and white context like that, I think shows more than anything else their ignorance of what is really going on. So just to clarify, I think that there might be some slight anthropogenic component in recent decades, but the primary driving factor over the centuries and millennia, and going back even further in time, is solar activity primarily, and other factors that can play into it, orbital parameters, the occasional, thing from outer space, whether it's a stellar burst or a galactic burst or a little comet, whatever. There are other factors. It's a much more complex situation than most people really think about.
Yeah. I guess the most well-known book you wrote is Forgotten Civilization.
Yeah, Forgotten Civilization.
And you've already mentioned some of the stuff that it deals with. Could you say something?
A lot of what we've been talking about here in Forgotten Civilization. So I really recommend that people who are interested, they hope they will pick up a copy and take a look at it. And to me, it's much more important. It's not just about ancient civilizations and all they're sort of interesting, but ancient civilizations and what happened to them, what happened at the last ice age, and what are the lessons, if you would. What do we need to learn from this? What do we need to know going forward? We need to think about what happened at the end of the last ice age, and how these types of events could repeat themselves, and start thinking societally as to how we can deal with this, because it's not a situation at this point where you can just on individual basis, in my opinion, make your own little plans and figure out how to survive the next solar outburst. The solar outbursts have had a major role in civilization and the comings and goings of civilization. For instance, I want to mention that the subtitle of the book, the title of the book is Forgotten Civilization, but the subtitle is The Role of Solar Outbursts in Our Past and Future. So that is a major theme of the book. And it's a book that should be of interest, and I know from some of my readers who have contacted me, is of interest to people who did not think they would be interested in ancient civilizations. They don't really care about what happened thousands of years ago. But a good chunk of the book, our major aspect of the book is, what could happen to us in the future? What should we be doing now? Yeah. I also want to say that the last chapter, I talked about modern science and how that ties in with ancient wisdom, ancient knowledge. The title of the last chapter is Ancient Wisdom, New Discoveries, and New Science, and how interestingly, and this is something I never imagined 25 years ago when I started studying such things, interestingly, I am now convinced that the ancient civilizations, especially the very remote ones, they may have known things that we don't know. They may have understood things that we're just starting to understand once again. So they may have had real knowledge that we don't have. Not necessarily, I'm not talking necessarily they had spaceships and, technological knowledge, but understanding about cycles of nature, understanding of sort of, I hate to put it in these terms, but deep philosophical understandings.
Okay.
If you want to use the term metaphysical understandings that we're just rediscovering, for instance, in things like cutting-edge physics.
Yeah. In the beginning of the show, you mentioned lectures that you gave on the internet. Is that correct?
Well, I speak, and some of them have gotten onto the internet, that type of thing.
Yeah.
But I would encourage people, what I would like to mention is people should go to my website, www.robertschoch, and just so people know how to spell it, SCHOCH, Robert Schoch, www.robertschoch, and robertschoch's one word, .com, C-O-M, and they can see where I might be lecturing. I'll be lecturing, for instance, at Virginia Beach in October, at Virginia Beach, Virginia in the U.S., but I do lectures around the world periodically, so as they come up, I post them on my website. And as I mentioned, too, I take people to some of these sites. So, for instance, I have scheduled right now a trip to Egypt again, which will be in the summer of 2016, May, June 2016, with some close friends of mine who do a great job of organizing the ground preparations in Egypt. I love Egypt. I've been to Egypt more times than I can remember, of course, for my research and just for my own interest. But I'll take people to Turkey. It's not posted yet, but I'm planning another trip to Turkey. When I say another trip, a trip where people can join me. There's a number of the sites in Turkey. And it really is, the internet is wonderful. And we get so much from the internet, so much information, but I want to stress that you cannot really fully comprehend a number of these sites without visiting them yourself, if one has the opportunity. There's nothing wrong with going to sit on the beach for a week, and that's a wonderful thing too, but sometimes people like to come on a trip with me as their vacation.
Yeah.
And get to see some of the sites. For instance, Göbekli Tepe, I'll use that as an example. I have taken people to Göbekli Tepe in the site we've been talking about in Turkey, and I've had some very well-seasoned travelers tell me they've visited a number of ancient sites that they just did not expect the power and the awe and the feeling, if you would, of actually being there on site.
Yeah.
Likewise, it's so true with Egypt. When I take people to Egypt and we go into the Great Pyramid and they go into the Great Pyramid for the first time, or we'll go down and actually see the Sphinx up close and go between the paws of the Sphinx and walk around the Sphinx. That's an experience you cannot get virtually.
Yeah. I got one more question from the chat. Is that okay?
Sure, of course.
Somebody asked, and I've never heard about this. Adam's calendar?
Oh, yes. Adam's calendar is something in South Africa. Michael Tellinger in particular has discussed this quite a bit and written about it. I have visited Adam's calendar with him.
Oh, it's a site.
It's a site, yes. It's basically, people think of it as a stone circle type site. I will give you bluntly my analysis of it. It's a bunch of rocks, and I'm not convinced that they were arranged artificially. I'm not convinced, honestly. I'm being very honest.
Sure.
And I don't want to speak for anyone else, but I'm not convinced that there's much of anything to it.
Okay.
I think it's been overblown, and you can find, I know as a geologist, you can find rocks all over the place. You can find boulder fields, and that's essentially what we have there, if you would. Well, a simple way of putting it, and you can pick out certain ones and say, oh, this aligns to that, and you have to be careful.
Yeah.
And I wasn't convinced that these were worked rocks or placed rocks. And that's my assessment of it at this point.
Yeah. In the email we had, there was also a mention of Cappadocia. What's that?
Oh, yes, Cappadocia. And when I take people to Turkey, we always go to visit the Cappadocia region, because Cappadocia, or it's sometimes called Cappadocia, depends on whether you like a hard C or a soft C. But Cappadocia/Cappadocia in Anatolia, in Turkey, it's one of the places, if I take people to Göbekli Tepe, or whenever I take people on a public tour to Turkey, I take them there because this is the region of underground cities. And it's an incredible region. We'll go and we'll visit them. We always go into one of the underground cities that's open to the public. There are several that are open to the public. It's just absolutely amazing. And I believe this ties in with exactly what we've been talking about, the end of the last ice age, because this seems to be a place where people survived the end of the last ice age. It's a geological terrain, and I use that as, in a technical sense, terrain, that is soft volcanic rock, if you would. I always explain, we talk about on-site in detail. It's an area that had natural caves, which then they expanded, they enlarged, and they were able to go underground, which would be the best way to protect you from solar outbursts, the solar outbursts that were happening at the end of the last ice age. And there is genetic evidence, there's linguistic evidence that a population survived in this region and then spread out. In fact, recent studies in linguistics have pointed to the region of Cappadocia as the origin of the Indo-European language groups at the end of the last ice age. Well, to me, this makes perfect sense with what I've been talking about, that populations survived that region by going into these underground structures at the end of the last ice age. And then they were able to reboot, if you would, civilization and spread out from there again. Now, I do want to point out that the standard story is that they built these underground cities much later, in Hittite times or Roman and Byzantine times to escape their enemies. I don't dismiss that they used these cities in later times, because if they exist, why not use them, or why not expand them and build them further? But they're not what you would use to escape your enemy in Greco-Roman times. a mere 2,000 years ago, what would your enemy do? They would just find the entrances to them and stop them up and let you starve to death and suffocate.
Huh.
That type of thing. But they were perfect. They would be perfect as essentially shelters from solar outbursts, from the radiation that you would have on the surface of the Earth during that period. So I think that's when they originated, even if they were used and expanded later for other purposes.
Yeah. Is there any danger in going to Göbekli Tepe because it's so close to the Syrian border and all the war going on there?
Yeah, I'll say bluntly no, because I have been right up to the Syrian border in the past, in the last couple of years. We were back there just this past month and a half ago in June, late June, and we found everything safe. Yes, we were in Urfa, which is a big city, 15 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe, and we were in a cafe eating lunch, and they had the television on, Turkish television on, and talking about the war that's going on, what's going on in Syria, just across the border.
Mm-hmm.
Not that far away, and I admit it's not that far away, but on the other hand, what you have to remember is that the Turkish armed forces are incredibly well trained, a very large standing army. They have, you see it sometimes, they are patrolling the border very carefully. They have everything under control, and they will not let it spill over. And recently, if you've been watching the news, a little bit ISIS, the Islamic State, has tried to spill over, and the Turks have kept it in check. In fact, now, of course, they're, I guess the latest I heard, they were doing air raids, that type of thing.
Uh-huh.
But I feel very confident that they have things under control, and they will not let anything happen to their border. Furthermore, they're part of NATO. So if anything did, it would be, things would happen very quickly. And I also want to point out, whenever I go there, I have contacts. We always have an official Turkish government guide with us at all times who is in communication. If anything should ever happen or there are any indications, we would take appropriate actions immediately. The last thing they want is to have foreigners in there caught up in something. So I take no risks like that.
Yeah.
We have everything under control. And I've got to say, this is something else I want to say. In Urfa, outside the major city, outside of Göbekli Tepe, and Urfa is a really interesting city and worth visiting for its own sake, because it is the traditional birthplace of Abraham, the prophet Abraham, the patriarch Abraham. You can visit Abraham's cave where supposedly he was born. You can see his pools. And in Urfa, they have just built, in the last 6 months it was opened, a magnificent museum. I mean, this is a world-class museum. I think it has a footprint of 200,000 square meters or something like that.
Uh-huh.
Beautiful marble facades. And in it, they have highlighted many of the sculptures and artifacts that have been found at Göbekli Tepe. And they've also done a reconstruction of one of the stone enclosures. So it's very interesting. We take people to the actual site. We also go to the museum to see both the real sculptures that have been removed when it was excavated and now put in the museum, incredible pieces of artwork. And they can see both the reconstruction of Göbekli Tepe, one of the stone circles in the museum, and then they can go see the actual thing, the real thing, in the field. So they get the best of everything.
Yeah. Here's two people asking about the same thing. I don't like to talk about it, but that's just me personally.
Oh, of course.
They want to know what you think of Zechariah Sitchin's work on the Sumerian tablets.
I know a lot of people who are very enamored, if I could put it that way, with Zechariah Sitchin and his work. I am not one of those people.
Okay.
I have as I said at the beginning of this conversation, I don't go the ancient alien route, which of course he did in a very big way. I have no problem if their aliens happen to have visit Earth in the past or do in the future or maybe are here in the present. I have no problem with that philosophically, but I think we need good evidence to support such a contention, and I don't see good support for that. And I've read Sitchin's works. I have not found them compelling or convincing personally. I do not read the Sumerian, but I have been in contact with people who claim to, just as he claimed to, and they have argued. I know people who I think, strongly argue against his interpretations, and I sort of take a neutral stance on it, should we say that.
Yeah.
I am pursuing other evidence independently and building on that evidence.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much. We've got about 4 minutes left till we reach the end of my event, as I call it.
Okay, well, it's been fun.
So I would like to mention your website, robertschoch.com. That's SCHOCH, robertschoch.com. People can go there, and they can also, if I understood you correctly, find lectures there, right?
Yeah, so they can find lectures, they can find my books, they can find links to trips that I'm involved with if they'd like to join for the sites. They can also be put on my mailing list. If they go to the front page, the first page, the home page of the website, and scroll down to the bottom, they will find the email address for my wife, Katie, Catherine Ulysses, and just send her an email, and you get on my mailing list. Or if there's they want to have direct communication with me, they can send her an email. She shares everything with me. Also, people can contact me through my Boston University email, and if you go to the my bio page, I have my contact information there, my personal contact information.
It's been pasted in the chat. Your links have been pasted in the chat like so many times. I've never heard this before, actually.
What's that?
A lot of your sites from the website robertschoch.com, like Plasma, your bio, and other things have been pasted in the chat. So people are really happy that you came along. Yeah.
Oh, good. Great.
Yeah. Okay. Any last words?
Well, I hope that everyone will visit my website. I hope that maybe some of you, people will want to come on a trip, or I'll see you at a lecture sometime. And also, one last word, something that I'm very excited about, and it's just getting off the ground now, is that I have co-founded, and I don't believe there's anything on my website yet about this, but I've co-founded a not-for-profit organization called Organization for the Research of Ancient Cultures, or for short, Oracle, ORACUL, and what we are.
I think I lost you there. What happened? I lost sound. This is not good, guys. Exactly at the end of the show. Oh my god. I will give him, Jules, I will give him thanks via the chat later. For now, I've got to mention the people in the chat to thank them for listening. Anouk, Anon, Captain Gringo, Dan, Hopper, JJ, Joe, Jules, Lavon, Matty Clues.
Hello?
Yeah, you're back.
Hello?
You're back.
Hello?
Are we still having sound problems?
I did. You can get me back.
Don't know what happened there. Popular, Road Dog, Tomato, and Vince.
Hello?
Hi, are you still there?
Are you there?
Yeah, but the end tune is running.
Hello?
I'm so sorry.
Apparently and historically.
Thanks a lot, Robert.
Hello?
The secret oaths and the secret proceedings.
Take care, buddy.
I think a new world order is emerging.
An inside job? How dare you?
Hello?
How dare you?
Hello?
Hi.
To create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of scientific.
My name is S.M. Gibson, and I am the host of Anti-Media Radio